The earliest Macedonian kings are mere legends. Macedonia begins to emerge into history when history, in the form of the Persians, rolls into Macedonia. In the year 512, Darius led a campaign against the Scufians north of the Danube. This proved to be a frustrating experience for Darius, so Darius departed, leaving as his commander in Europe Megabazus, who then proceeded to clear up some loose ends, one of which was Macedonia. In Herodotus' telling of the story, Megabazus sent envoys to the Macedonians, demanding that they hand over the traditional sign of submission, that of earth and water. Amyntas didn't refuse, and at once decided to put on a banquet to honour the envoys. After having drunk a lot of wine, the Persian envoys told Amyntas that it was a Persian custom that on occasions like this, that the women should join the men. Amyntas, in the telling of Herodotus, is a pathetically weak character, and he orders the wives, concubines, and daughters of the Macedonians to come into the room. Alexander, his son, is portrayed as much tougher, and as soon as the envoys begin to fondle the women, Alexander tells his father to get lost because he is going to handle the situation. Amyntas is quite terrified of the prospect that his son is going to do something really rash and provoke war with the Persians. But he's as incapable of standing up to his son as he is to the Persians, and he quickly departs. Then, as soon as he has got rid of his father, Prince Alexander tells the envoys that they will be free to have intercourse with all of the women or with as many as they wish. However, he suggests, it will be far better if the envoys allow the effects of the alcohol to wear off a little, and in the meantime the women will withdraw to bathe themselves. Once the women have departed, Alexander goes off and recruits a bunch of youths who are sufficiently young that their beards have not begun to grow. And these youths come in, dressed in women's clothes, armed with daggers, and the unsuspecting envoys, as they're about to embrace these supposed women, feel a knife in their breasts. And you know what? No one got to hear about what happened. No one? And we're not talking just about the disappearance of the envoys themselves. We would not expect high-born Persians to travel alone. Indeed, Herodotus himself mentions the large number of servants who came in tow, and there must also have been an armed guard. So what happened to them? Well, actually, Herodotus does have an answer to that. All of them were murdered too, and the baggage train was disposed of. That's an awful lot of people to murder, and an awful lot of people must have been involved in the killing, not to mention the disposal of the baggage train. And there must have been witness. You can't do that kind of thing without other people noticing. So none of them breathed a word. Did none of those beardless youths boast of their role in protecting the honour of Macedonia? Herodotus does have an answer. Sort of. Herodotus, continuing his story, tells us that Megabazus sent an investigation under the general Bubares to see what had happened to the envoys. Alexander, to keep this Bubares quiet, gave Bubares a large sum of money and the hand of his sister in marriage. And so Bubares didn't breathe a word of what had happened to his father, Megabazus. Yes, father. Herodotus has been quite careful at this point not to mention that Megabazus has sent his own son to do the investigation. No one today seriously believes the story of the murder of the envoys. Normally it's put down to Herodotus being a bit too gullible in taking over a bit of Macedonian propaganda. Not quite sure that Herodotus was quite so unwitting. The story has the hallmarks of a Herodotus composition, with the culture clash and the titillating sex and the clever, cunning ruse. Does look like the story that Herodotus has written from whole cloth. At the same time, it's the kind of story that the Macedonians would want to be circulating in the era when the Greeks were victorious and had driven out the Persians from Europe. It explains how Alexander, who though on the surface had been rather too pro-Persian, had all along been a secret opponent of the Persians. The marriage between Bubares and Alexander's sister is almost certainly the seed of truth in the whole story. That marriage ensured that Alexander would be trusted by the Persians, and it seems as a result that Macedonia benefited from the era of Persian dominance. Thucydides describes Macedonian expansion, but he's a little vague as to when things happened and even exactly in the order they happened. This is what he writes in his history in Book 2, Chapter 99. The maritime country which we now call Macedonia was conquered and formed into a kingdom by Alexander the father of Perdiccas and his ancestors the Terminidae, who originally came from Argos. Thucydides then goes on to list a large number of conquests which Alexander, plus his ancestors, achieved. Thucydides does make it clear that Alexander did make a major contribution to Macedonian expansion. But not only is he not clear as to exactly which part of that expansion was down to Alexander, he gives no indication as to when it actually happened. Did Alexander's gains occur during the time of Persian dominance, in which case the Persians permitting Alexander to make conquests would be a kind of reward for loyal service? Or maybe Alexander bided his time and waited until the Persian power collapsed as a result of the Battle of Plataea, when they were defeated by the Spartans and the Athenians, and then exploited the resulting vacuum. But while nothing is certain, we can perhaps be a bit more specific than that. Thucydides tells us that they, meaning Alexander and his ancestors, acquired a narrow portion of Paeonian territory by the river Axius, extending to Pella and to the sea. Herodotus also tells us that Dareios, after his rather futile campaign against the Scufians, deported a section of the Paeonians to Anatolia. This section of Paeonian territory would be Amphixatis, and it opened the way for further Macedonian expansion eastward. Around the year 506, the Spartans attempted to restore the Athenian tyrant Hippias as tyrant in Athens, but the expedition ended in a complete fiasco, and in the wake of this, Amyntas offered Hippias land in Anthemus, which rather suggests that at that time Macedonia controlled that territory as well. A late writer, Justin, tells us that Amyntas died shortly after Bubares had been called back to Persia. Eugene Borza suggests that this is most likely to have happened around the time of the Ionian Revolt, and therefore concludes that Amyntas' death, and therefore Alexander's succession, was in the year 498 or 497. While Amphixatis and Anthemus are likely to have been gains of Amyntas, there are three regions mentioned by Thucydides that lie still further to the east, that of Mugonia, Crestonia, and Bisaltia. These are plausibly the gains of Alexander, Amyntas' son. I've spent quite a bit of time talking about the conquests of Amyntas and Alexander because really there isn't much known about how they ruled Macedonia itself. There's a hint of the internal organization of Macedonia in a treaty signed not by Alexander but by his son Perdiccas. This was a treaty signed with the Athenians, and what is interesting is the number of magnates who had to swear to keep the treaty. Not just Perdiccas the king, but also several of his brothers and several of the sub-kings of Upper Macedonia. And given that this treaty is an inscription that isn't complete, there is some dispute about how many others should really be included. Although this treaty belongs to the reign of Perdiccas, Alexander's son, if, and that is a big if it was signed immediately after Perdiccas succeeded to the kingdom, then it gives a pretty good hint of how Macedonia was organized under Alexander himself. But does the very diversity of magnates who were expected to swear to keep the treaty show that Macedonia was a harmonious aristocracy in which power was shared mutually? Or is it a sign that the Athenians thought that Macedonia was a failed state and that they had to get all these extra people in to sign it because otherwise the treaty would be worthless? And even if we take the view that actually this is a sign that under Alexander Macedonia was well run and harmonious, is this something that Alexander had achieved through his rule, and that previously Macedonia had been very disorganized? Or perhaps Alexander simply inherited a system of harmonious aristocracy, which he merely continued? In which case, perhaps it's Perdiccas who starts the cycle of civil wars by attempting to grab too much power into his own hands. Well, your guess is as good as any other.